One of the main reasons why it took me so long to get started with long exposure photography was the cost. You see, when I say long exposure, I don't mean just a few seconds, but 30 seconds, 1 minute, several minutes, even during the day. And to achieve that, we need very dark glass. We are talking about 10 stop ND filters, 15 stop ND filters, and those do not come cheap. So for a long time I put it off because I wasn't sure if that was something I wanted to do, if it was just a gimmick. That was until I found a cheaper alternative, not perfect, but good enough that I got a taste of what long exposure photography was and what I could do with it. Something that changed my photography forever, and it might change yours as well. An alternative that many years later I find myself using again because, as you might know, I broke or lost all of my ND filters in the last couple of months. I'm still in the market for new ND filters, I'm still doing my research, but for the time being I am using what I'm gonna be talking about in this video, the good old welding glass. It looks like a regular ND filter, but it's not. We'll be talking about using welding glass for long exposure photography, which welding glass to buy and where, and the pros and the cons compared to using regular ND filters. But first, I want to thank all of my patrons for their support, with a special thanks to Steve Bennett today, a British photographer who is not only a big supporter of my work, but also has some amazing images himself. Please check out his website and social media accounts following the links in the description down below. And please consider joining us over on Patreon, where we hold live streams and where I share some behind-the-scenes material. I'm not sure what I first heard about the idea of using welding glass for long exposure photography. It was not my idea, of course, and I'm almost pretty sure that it was here on YouTube, and I'm almost pretty sure that it was in this video. So credits where credits are due. By now you know that I love long exposure photography and the dreamy, moody images that it produces. I was hoping to make a few long exposures on this trip to San Francisco, that's where I am right now, and being so close to the water, that is something that I enjoy doing. But as you might know, I broke my last surviving ND filter a few days ago on a beach just south of here. That was my 15 stop ND filter. I had another two, a 6 and a 10, but I lost them on another beach, this time in France, a couple of months ago, so now I am down to 0 filters. I was very disappointed when I saw that broken filter on the beach because I thought I would have to ditch my plans for any kind of long exposure photography that I wanted to do here in the city. But then I remember what I did a few years ago, how I got started with long exposure photography. I headed to a hardware store and got myself a piece of welding glass. In this case, this is a shade 10. The bigger the number, the darker the glass. The same with regular ND filters. They are not equivalent. I found a table online somewhere many years ago that I had saved in my computer. That table is not accurate because not all the welding glass that says shade 10 is gonna be exactly the same. I've tested this one, the shade 10, and it gives me something between 12 and 13 stops, which is pretty good and pretty close to my beloved 15 stop ND filter. I'm not gonna get too deep into the topic of long exposure photography in this video, but I have an ebook that you can download for free from my website. You can find the link in the description down below. I also have a couple videos from many years ago. I think it's time to make new ones with slightly higher production value. But anyway, to the point, I love long exposure photography because it gives you access to a world that is hidden to us. It's something that we can't see with our own eyes, even if it's just a few seconds. A photo of a waterfall for 5-10 seconds, and that smooths out the water. That's something that we can't see. It's not what we see when we are there. But the real magic happens when we move on to 30 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, several hours. Most of my long exposures are anywhere between 1 and 5 minutes. I find that more than enough, but some of them are longer, much longer. The longest long exposure I've ever taken was this photo, and I have a video about this one, by the way, that you can watch up there. It's a very old one, so just keep that in mind. But it was a 4-hour long exposure of the full moon rising behind Mount St. Helens in Washington State. For me to be able to expose a photograph for that long, I need very dark ND filters. I had a set of 3, 6, a 10, and a 15 stop ND filters. They came with a holder that I have somewhere around here. There you go. The holder makes it very easy to operate the camera, make sure that the composition is right, that you're focusing on the right place, and then just mount the filter without having to touch anything else. But again, these are not cheap. Each one of those ND filters cost me $125. The holder might be another 50 or 60 on top of that, and you need some adapters as well. It is an expensive technique, and that's why it took me so long, why I put it off for so long. And that maybe that's the reason why you haven't tried it just yet. This is where welding glass can be very helpful, because I bought this piece of glass for $12. So that's 10 times cheaper than an ND filter. So this can be a very easy and affordable way for a photographer to try out long exposure photography and see if that's something they like, something that they want to do in the future. Or for those photographers who want to have that option of doing long exposure photography, but it's not a big part of their photography and they don't want to commit to very expensive pieces of glass that they are rarely gonna use. Those are the situations and those are the scenarios where I think welding glass can help quite a lot. And this is of course because of the price. That is the one big, huge advantage of using this glass, welding glass, instead of regular ND filters. When we talk about price, you hear that some people say that yeah, ND filters are expensive, but it's something that is gonna last you for a long time, so it's worth it. And I kind of agree. Yes, they lasted me 6 years, so it was worth it. I made a lot of images with those ND filters, and that's why I'm gonna buy more. But they are very fragile pieces of glass. They will break if you drop them. They will scratch if you don't protect them in your backpack. So yeah, they will last a long time if you take proper care of them, but accidents happen. If the cost of your gear, the money that you paid for your camera, your lens, your filters is gonna hold you back because you are afraid of damaging it, because you are afraid of losing it, then all of that becomes even more expensive because you are not using it. And many times we are better off buying the cheaper alternatives, lower quality filters, lenses that are not as good as the expensive ones, and cameras that don't have all the fancy features, but stuff that we are not afraid of taking out in the rain, in the snow, or to sketchy places and use them. You're gonna get much better results from a just okay camera and lens that you actually take with you, that you actually use, than from the best camera you can afford, but you're gonna leave sitting on the shelf. Using welding glass instead of expensive ND filters might just do that for you. This is the welding glass. It's a pretty big piece of glass. It looks like an ND filter, but it is not. It has a lot of downsides, and that's what we're gonna be talking about now, the cons of using welding glass versus using regular ND filters. The first one is color cast. Now, it's very important to make clear that most ND filters that you can buy out there will have a color cast as well. You're gonna have to spend a lot of money to get a pretty close to neutral ND filter, but the color cast with welding glass is just off the charts. As you should expect, because they are not designed for this, they are not designed for photography, they are not designed to be perfectly neutral to all the colors. This is not a huge problem for someone like me because I shoot in black and white, so the color cast is not going to have any effect if you shoot black and white film, or if you convert your raw files to black and white in post. That being said, one thing I really like about digital photography is having the raw file there with all the color information, just in case I want to use it. It's very rarely that I touch the colors in a photo, but sometimes I do change the luminance, the brightness of a specific color to make something stand out in the frame or to actually hide it a little bit more. Another con is that, of course, image quality takes a little bit of a toll with welding glass compared to ND filters.
But perhaps not as much as you might think. Let's take a look at these 3 long exposures I made in San Francisco, and please keep in mind that these were made with a 42 megapixel camera. It was very windy, so they are never going to be as sharp as a regular shot, but as you can see, they are very clear and very sharp, especially considering that I made them with a $12 piece of glass in front of the lens.
Again, not a huge problem for me and my style of photography, but something we should be aware of. But the biggest disadvantage of using welding glass, in my opinion, the deal breaker for me and the reason why I don't use it, why this is just a temporary fix for this trip, is that there is no good way to actually attach the filter to the front of the lens and to keep it there. The good thing about spending money on something that was designed with photography in mind and something that was designed to be used with your cameras and lenses is the stuff, all this stuff that comes with them, like this ring adapter that screws on the lens, this holder that attaches to that ring adapter, and that it allows you to just easily slide the filters there, and that's it. You don't have to do anything else. But how do you attach a filter that has no standard size, that it has no holes or no way to actually keep it there stable and without falling? Well, welding glass requires a more DIY approach. Back in the day when I used the Bronica, when I was shooting film with the Bronica, I used to use very long rubber bands to keep the filter in place in front of the lens, but that was a little bit clunky. Sometimes the glass would snap off, or the rubber band would break or something like that. And it was less than ideal because it can ruin an exposure that you might not be able to take again, to repeat, because the conditions have changed or because the subject has moved or for whatever reason. At some point, I even tried to glue the welding glass to a step-out ring, so it was almost like a DIY screw-on huge ND filter. It worked for a while. It eventually fell apart. I don't know if the glue wasn't the right one for glass, but at that point it didn't really matter because I was already in love with long exposure photography, and I had already decided to make the investment on a better system. Until now, of course, when I lost my ND filters and I'm back to welding glass and I needed to figure out a way to keep the glass there still and stable while I'm taking a long exposure with my digital camera. My first idea was to use rubber bands all the way from the welding glass to the back of the camera, but I ran into a problem, is that I'm using a zoom lens. Now, this lens has a lock switch here, and that is very useful because it keeps the lens from extending when you are transporting it. It slowly creeps in. This was not the case when I first bought it. It was very stiff, but now if you don't lock it in place, as you can see, so very useful, but this only locks the lens at 28 millimeters. You cannot lock the lens at 50 millimeters, say, or any other focal length. You might already be seeing the problem. If I want to take a long exposure at, say, 50 millimeters, I have to extend the lens a little bit. But as soon as I place the glass in front of the lens and grab the whole thing with the rubber bands, those are going to create pressure on the lens and it's going to make it collapse. So using it that way would only allow me to take long exposures at 28 millimeters, which again is less than ideal. So after a little bit of thinking, I came up with a solution that, even though it's still less than ideal, it's better because it lets me do long exposures at any given focal length with my zoom lens. And to achieve that, I am using the elements that came with my Lee system, the ring adapter and the holder. It is very simple. Instead of attaching the welding glass with rubber bands directly to the camera, I'm attaching them to the holder. So that way I can use the welding glass in a very similar way, almost identical to the way that I was using my ND filters. It's still very clunky, not as smooth because the rubber bands get in the way all the time, but good enough. I made a few long exposures here in San Francisco during the last couple of days using welding glass, and even though the weather was just terrible for long exposure photography, yesterday was cloudy but extremely windy, and today was no wind at all, but it's just sunny and clear and harsh light. Yucky. But still, the experience and the results were very close to the ones that I was getting with my regular ND filters at a fraction of the cost. This is where we cycle back to the beginning, where I was talking about the big advantage of this approach, and it's the low barrier, low cost of entry. For those of you who have been wanting to try long exposure photography but couldn't justify the high price of the ND filters, welding glass can be a very good, very cheap alternative for you to just get a taste of what long exposure can offer you. Also, for those of you who want to have the option of doing long exposure photography but not necessarily make it a big part of your photography, welding glass can be a very good way to achieve that as well. And lastly, this can be very useful for those of us who just lost or broke our filters, and while we don't buy new ones, we need a fast, cheap way to keep doing long exposures. You can buy welding glass at almost any hardware store for very cheap, so it can be a quick and easy fix if you are far from home and you don't have access to the places where you usually shop, but you still want to do some long photography while on the road. Anyway, that's all I wanted to share today. If you have any questions about long exposure photography or long exposure photography welding glass, please leave a comment down below. I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.